And we're back. Yay. What a pain in the buns. That was awful. Here we are. Thank you. All right. Let's see if this plays.
Neurons communicate over long distances by generating and sending electrical signals called action potentials.
Hey, hey.
Most action potentials originate in the axon's initial segment, a region also called the trigger zone. During an action potential, voltage-gated sodium and potassium channels open and close, thus altering the membrane's permeability to sodium and potassium ions. As these ions diffuse through the channels, the membrane potential changes. It depolarizes from the resting state of minus 70 millivolts to a peak value of plus 30
Oh,
millivolts.
did we hear this one
And
already?
then quickly repolarizes back to
Well,
minus
okay.
60 millivolts after a brief period
I'm sorry. Here. We'll
of
stop.
hyperpolarization.
Okay. Repolarization. Resets. I lost my place. I'm sorry. Okay. Membrane, all or none. Okay. Propagation. Self-propagating. Forward. Oh, so we did see this. I'm sorry. This is the one I don't think we saw. Don't start again. Ah, drive me crazy. Well, go ahead. Anytime you're ready.
Action potentials propagate in a continuous fashion in unmyelinated axons. Once an action potential is generated in the initial segment of the axon, it propagates the entire length of the axon. Recall that a threshold stimulus causes voltage-gated sodium channels to open. The influx of sodium ions generates an action potential. It also establishes a depolarizing current that flows to the next segment and brings it to threshold. Voltage-gated sodium channels open, regenerating the action potential in this segment of the axon. Current flows from this segment and depolarizes the next segment to threshold, thus regenerating the action potential yet again. In this way, regeneration continues in one direction all the way down to the axon terminals. The basis for unidirectional propagation is revealed when we take a closer look. By the end of the depolarization phase of the action potential, all voltage-gated sodium channels inactivate and voltage-gated potassium channels open. These two events render this segment of the axon temporarily insensitive or refractory to another depolarizing stimulus. However, voltage-gated sodium channels in the downstream segment are closed and receptive to a depolarizing stimulus. Thus, propagation occurs sequentially down the axon to the axon terminals. In myelinated axons, action potential propagation is a bit different. Here they propagate in a saltatory or leaping fashion. The myelin sheath consists of multiple layers of tightly wrapped glial cell membrane. But this sheath is not a continuous one. Exposed areas of axonal membrane, known as nodes of Ranvier, occur at discrete intervals. Voltage-gated sodium channels are abundant in the nodes, but largely absent between nodes. So, action potentials are regenerated at each node, not in areas covered by the myelin sheath. However, the myelin sheath does provide the insulation necessary for the rapid spread of depolarizing current. And the sooner the nodes reach threshold, the faster action potentials propagate along the axon. Saltatory conduction is extremely fast. Velocities often exceed 100 meters per second. In contrast, continuous conduction is fairly slow. Velocities rarely exceed 2 meters per second. Nevertheless, Both continuous and saltatory conduction propagate action potentials over varying distances because action potentials regenerate along the way. Summary: propagation of an action potential. Once generated, the action potential propagates the entire length of the axon without decrement.
Okie dokie. So that gives you a good idea. The speed is very, very significant. Okay. Action potentials, they're independent of intensity. We don't, again, intensity is measured by frequency of stimulation. That's the amplitude. So how much it hurts is how much this thing, how loud it is, like it was before I adjusted the sound. So the difference between a weak stimulus and a strong one is frequency of impulses received per seconds. That's really important because effectively all of those stimuli are identical. So you can see that the more rapid versus, let's say, more regularly spaced. Refractory periods become more significant because they resolve so quickly here, but they become a lot more significant to me, I think, when we start to deal with cardiac, because then we see a much more prolonged absolute refractory period. So when it can't trigger another, voltage-gated sodium channels are open, so the neuron cannot respond. Voltage-gated sodium channels are open, so the neuron cannot respond to another stimulus. I don't know if that's well stated. Refractory would indicate that, to me, that the channels were closed or at least inactivated to some extent. So the absolute refractory period, the time from opening the sodium channels until resetting those channels, and that an inactivation gate swings away, all in an event, one-way transmission. Relative is always after the absolute refractory period, having returned to their resting state. Most of them, even though some channels are open and repolarization is recurring, what it just means is that the threshold is a greater burden. So you might be the relative refractory period, maybe during that overshoot phase where it's hyperpolarized. So rather than being 15 millivolts, it's 20 or 25 millivolts. A strong stimulant. I don't like analogies. My dog is very refractory. It's a very refractory dog. But as of Friday, he got the run of the house after a year and a half. Trying to keep him separated from the cats. We figured, have at it. But the cat, we have a karate cat. Ah, Kung Fu Panda. This is Kung Fu Kitty. I'll take you on with my tail tied behind my back. Go ahead. I can just see the cat there. He's going, feeling lucky. Clint Eastwood would play him. Cloud the cat. So there it is. So again, this is absolute because you see that effectively, it isn't until this begins to play, the refractory period and the repolarization gets almost approaching back down to resting or close to it, that it enters that relative refractory period. So the velocities are proportional to the diameter, large diameter fibers, less resistance, faster conduction, and the amount of myelination. Those are the two big factors. And again, versus the non-myelinated or limitedly continuous versus the saltatory or jumping conduction. Okay, it's significantly faster. They commented on that animation of about 100 meters per second. I've read a number of authors up to 200 with certain nerves. If you do the math, and I don't, I just plug it into an app on the phone. That's about 440 miles an hour. I did that just when we were 200 meters per second is 447.387 miles per hour. I'm impressed. However, the nerves are going, it's faster than that if you want to think of it. That's the signal being conducted. To me, the limitation is like when you talk to somebody who's in California, or when I talk to my son out in the Persian Gulf. Okay, we're talking in real time. There's a tiny amount of delay that I've noticed with a couple of times I spoke with him from the Gulf, but not a lot. But I mean, 447 miles an hour. I mean, if you want to think of it, that's why it takes you 5 hours to get to LA from here. 4.5, 5 hours. Yes, sir.
Wait, I just realized. How do you talk? Like cell phone, or is it like?
So,
I didn't know if they had like.
yeah, I mean, he got an international number that's capable of doing that, but he only can use that when he's close enough, close enough to port to get a signal. And then everybody's on the deck trying to call somebody. It must be a funny sight to see 300, 300 400 individuals on the deck. So that's the idea. We speak electronically. We cover great distances. Whether we're over the internet or we're at a computer, or even some of the discussions that we're having, over any of the Google Meets or Zoom. Comparatively speaking, it's faster than this nerve conduction. But nerve conduction is not slow. What makes it slower, again, and we'll get to that in the next PowerPoint, are the chemicals. That's the neurotransmitters. Myelin sheaths prevent leakage. The sheath gaps or nodes of Ranvier. The action potentials generate there. It appears to jump, but it does not. It's just that's where the concentration of voltage-gated channels are located. Voltage-gated sodium and potassium channels are located at those gaps. And I mean, that's what gives it this sort of appearance. So a non-myelinated is continuous versus here, the channels are located in those gaps. So again, years ago, we used to say, oh, it's like going over because this is an insulator. The reality is it's going through relatively quickly without obstruction. Classic autoimmune disease, we cover that in the immune system. I'm sure for many of you in immunology, you're covered more than once, both with Dr. Maurer and myself doing that, but it's a tragic, difficult disease. Well, as any of these autoimmune or immunologically based diseases are, they have a broad spectrum. I mean, I have one. I have an immunological form of arthritis, but I'm hardly affected. I'm only medication and the injections I take put me in the portion of the curve that really doesn't limit my activities. But more than half the people with MS have significant degrees of activity limitation, so it really affects them tremendously. It can be both in the central and to some extent in the peripheral nervous system. Hardened lesions in the myelin. Anything that's hardened, that's where the term sclerosis or sclerotic comes from. Changes impulse conduction, demyelinates, etc., etc. Again, the channels we use most rapidly are the ones that are affected visually first, that are their weakness, speech disturbances, and eventually it's more of those. And if you've heard me say it already more than once, vitamin D. Here to tell you, wouldn't hurt to start taking, not to overdose on vitamin D. In my opinion, I mean, my wife and I get them. We get, good quality vitamins. They have not high levels, but higher levels have been associated with limiting the likelihood of breast cancer in women, prostate cancer in men, this type of stuff. Your call. So, I mean, again, young, healthy individuals don't often see that as much as when we get older, you become more sensitive to that. I'm sure if you monitored, like on Amazon, vitamin sales, most of them would be for there's going to be a X number of health nuts, but a lot of them are going to be to older people. Just saying. They classify the fibers. To me, it's not a big deal. Group A, as you can see, so it's 150 meters a second. Like I said, I've seen as much as 2, but this is if you're thinking sciatic nerve, femoral nerve, that type of, those kinds of nerves that are there, very, very significantly large. Intermediate, slower, The unmyelinated, very, very much slower. And again, you see more of those when we get to the autonomic nervous system. It's not as rapid a system. And again, when it's not a rapid system for causing something to occur, it takes a long time for the effects comparatively to go away. That's the consistent finding. Things that occur rapidly, correct rapidly. Things that occur slowly stay there. And so there's a number of different factors. Local anesthetics, have you ever wondered how they work? They block voltage gated sodium channels. That's why they work. And depending on how they're formulated, and the original one, which everybody called, was known as Procaine, which everybody called Novocaine, dissipates relatively quickly. That's why it's not used as much as it used to be. It was the first one. It had an ester linkage rather than an amide linkage, which is what lidocaine, which is now used more commonly than it is. So it takes longer for your body to metabolize it. You get into the pharmacology. And I said I have a ton of experience. I'd say 90% of the cases I did were under local or local with sedation. That type of thing. So we didn't have occasion to use as much general as some. Local anesthetics act by blocking voltage-gated sodium channels. Cold can play a role with this. Blood supply, and that's really the phenomena that you see in cold, how frequently we feel things that appear to be numb, but typically respond relatively quickly. But when your arm falls asleep, your foot falls asleep, from having it positionally, you're typically obstructing blood vessels transiently. So that's everything for that. Which brings us to to me, maybe the most significant physiological part of the nervous system is sort of talked about in this particular portion of the presentation, and that is when we get into the events at the synapse and the neurotransmitter. So it's less about what's going on than it is about different kinds of synaptic connections and specifically the neurotransmitters that are part of it. In therapeutics, it's all about the neurotransmitters. Really is. So you will see this, and I'll give you a few little nuggets about those things. Works as information flows from nerve to nerve, connected by synapses, junctions, one nerve to another, or to whatever the end cell is, like a muscle cell, would be the effector or gland. So we call, and just by definition, you'll see this when we get to the autonomic, which is a two-nerve circuit. They jump at what's called the synapse, the accumulation of synapses are called the ganglion. So we talk about here presynaptic and postsynaptic. In the next chapter we do, which is autonomic, which I'm sure is not on. I don't think is on the first exam. Is we talk about preganglionic and postganglionic nerves. So, and most nerves function as both. Okay, so we see a variety of things because there's so many nerves that are involved in the circuitry that they're both pre and postsynaptic nerves. So here we're going to be looking at mostly this, the axodendritic synapse. That is typically the one that's the chemical based involving neurotransmitters. Are there ones that go directly to the soma or the cell body or the perikaryon? Yes. Are there ones and these are modifiers. Axoaxonal and axosomatic are maybe, think of it, you have a response, but the response is not as dramatic or modified in some way. So we hear about, in the old days, we used to talk about things that were called neuromodulators. The terminology has changed. So you had things that were excitatory, inhibitory. Now, ones that make subtle changes that we associate with the synapses. It's a pretty good illustration, actual micrograph of what happens. These are what the synapses look like. Again, it's actually a space that's there. So the ones that we're going to, and these are the axodendritic and the axosomatic are the most common. These are just there for the sake of completeness. It's not a big deal for us, whether it's axoaxonal or dendrodendritic or somatodendritic. And yes, the two main types, chemical, which we'll focus on, and electrical, which certainly are part of the picture as well. Neurotransmitters. The axon terminal, the presynaptic neuron, synaptic vesicles, neurotransmitter. which correspond to or are going to trigger the receptor region on the postsynaptic membrane. Typically a dendrite, sometimes a cell body. Yes, it's a finite space. Yes, it's a fluid-filled cleft. So we're making a transition in communication, and why we see is slowing down to a mere 300 or 400 miles an hour. Okay. Oh, I'm coming to a stop sign. I better slow down. I got to go from 300 down to 0 pretty quickly. Is that synapse? That to me is, again, the rate determining step that's involved here. It's a synaptic cleft. Yes, it prevents nerves from directly passing. It's chemical, not electrical. It's about the release of, how rapidly it diffuses across, how efficiently it binds, and the unidirectional nature of it. I think I'll skip that. Look at the steps. And you've seen these are very, very similar to the, effectively the acetylcholates and neuromuscular junction. Action potential at the axon terminal, good old voltage gated calcium channels. Calcium, facilitates this, the fusion of the synaptic vesicles, all those wonderful C snares and T snares. Calcium entry causes synaptotagmin to react with the snare proteins, fusing them. The higher the impulse frequency, the more vesicles exocytose, leading to a greater effect on the postsynaptic cell. Again, frequency dictates the amount of release and the continuous nature of the release of the neurotransmitter, that whatever one it is for that particular circuit. And again, it's different than the muscular system. The neuromuscular junction is about acetylcholine. Understand that nerves typically have more, based on the frequency and the other factors that are involved, release more than one neurotransmitter. Like even, and I said this before, the nerve going from the spinal cord, let's say, to a muscle is acetylcholine. The nerve going from your brain to the spinal cord has at least two, because it'll either be one will be excitatory and one will be inhibitory. One will tell the muscle more likely to contract, one will tell them make the muscle less likely to contract. And they're really important, particularly therapeutically, that are there. And you've seen the illustrations like this, the neurotransmitter diffuses, binds, opens, chemically gated, what are chemically gated ion channels, creating, again, the terminology, just like end plate potentials, graded potentials, can be excitatory or inhibitory. Some receptor proteins are, and it's a subtle difference, as you will see. Some of these neurotransmitters open ion channels, which are very rapid, as opposed to affecting G protein channels, which are not quite as rapid, not slow by any means, but not quite as rapid. So it depends on what they're stimulating. And here you can see it, the graded potentials emanating. As long as the neurotransmitter is there, they'll continue. Almost immediately, if it was an isolated event, again, the three ways, just like a neuromuscular junction, most common in the nervous system, reuptake. In the case of acetylcholine, it's the reuptake of the choline after it has been degraded by enzymes, acetylcholinesterase, for instance, but reuptake really predominates that are there. There is some diffusion, there is some degradation, or metabolism. I tend to use the term metabolism for it, but I'll try to make sure on an exam perspective that I have both names that are there. So you're going to see that we interplay therapeutically with reuptake, mostly with things called reuptake inhibitors. They're the big category. If they inhibit reuptake, it means more of the neurotransmitter is prolonged at the synapse. It will prolong the effect for the most part. The time needed, and again, this is delay, the timing that we've been talking about earlier, be released, diffuse across the synapse, and bind to the receptors quick, less than 1 millisecond in some instances. But still, that's enough to slow that talking to somebody in real time halfway across the world versus 400 miles an hour. You want to think of it now. So it's all fast. The electrical synapses are less common. Gap junctions, as you might suspect, very rapid, might be in more than one directions. So this is where, if you want to think of it this way, yes, it's mostly abundant in embryonic nervous tissue as part of the development, but you can see some of these emotions and memory. They've studied it enough to realize that it does play a role. So again, amount of neurotransmitter, the time is there, and this is how we will consistently categorize them: EPSPs and IPSPs. They're either going to be excitatory or inhibitory postsynaptic potentials, and effectively we sum it. Is it more excited? If there's enough excitatory to bring it to threshold, the nerve fires. If they offset, they offset. If it's inhibitory, it's just harder. And they do it. Fire, fire, fire. That's on fire. You just see the nerve going, you're confusing me. Or if I was there, I'd say, shut the front door. What does one nerve say to the other nerve? I don't like that as much as the one shepherd to the other shepherd. Remember, get the flock out of here? You guys probably go home or wherever you go and go, he's telling those stupid old jokes my grandpa told. That's what you particularly. I pick on your buddy, but she's not here. Illness, potentially. Pardon? I'm sorry. Neurotransmitters. Simultaneous flow sodium, potassium. We know all about that. Excitatory. Okay. Trecker threshold. Here's the excited. So they can be either excitatory, closer to threshold, or inhibitory, hyperpolarizing. And normally this is what happens. The one we see more frequently is not potassium going out, but chloride going in. They're called chloride-gated channels. Chloride-gated channels are a big player. What you did over the weekend undoubtedly involved chloride-gated channels.
No.
Yes.
You're joking.
Just say. If you know somebody takes a sleeping pill, chloride-gated channel. Someone takes a sedative, an Ativan, a Xanax, originally diazepam, which is Valium, or those were all affected chloride-gated channels. Okay, so it moves farther away from threshold. So even though they depict potassium exiting, it's more often than not chloride going in. And yes, they summate. So a single excitatory event can't create an action potential, but they add together. And so it's a combination of all of these things, and they summate over time and over space. So how many places they're being contacted and how frequently. Again, those are the two big factors. Probably frequency, number one, and how abundant the signals are, number two. Okay. So if it produces another excitatory postsynaptic potential before it dissipates, it will summate. Or if it's over a large area, it will summate. So isolatedly, not enough time to summate. But if you have them in a relatively short span, they can summate enough that the second one, let's say in this instance, graphically will reach. Versus here, when you have it spatially, so you have multiple inputs in the same, more or less the same area that are there. This is a very interesting phenomena called synaptic potentiation. So everybody in this room knows somebody who takes an SSRI. That's called a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. It makes more serotonin available at the synapse. Paxil, Prozac, Zoloft, most antidepressant commonly prescribed antidepressant mechanisms, not just for mild depression, for eating disorders, for obsessive compulsive disorders, sometimes for ADD type disorders. Those are used very, very commonly. They don't work right away. So, a classic example, someone will go to whoever prescribes them, whoever the prescribing physician is, and then they'll come back 2 weeks later. How do you feel? Oh, I feel great. Never felt great. It really worked. That's called a placebo effect. That means take a pill, I feel better, because they take typically at least a month, as much as 2 months, to see the effect. This is what synaptic potentiation is. So repeated use increases its ability to excite the postsynaptic. So if the theory is that there is serotonin is either insufficient or insufficiently there, and it's not just one type of serotonin receptors, there's many subcategories of receptors. And so what we're doing is we're targeting specific receptors for a specific neurotransmitter. That's how why one choice might be better for one concern versus another choice. Why one might be better in children versus adults, or elderly versus young adults. Okay? So pharmacology is pretty advanced in that regard. And the other nugget with regard to pharmacology is side effect package. That, because I remember when I was teaching grad students in Chatham, like the lab component of this, and I talked to the neurologist doing the lecture from Pitt, and I said, why pick Zoloft or Paxil or Prozac? And he just said very simply, side effect package. Because they're very, very similar. And then is it a child, is it an adult, is it a teenager, etc. So calcium concentration increases in presynaptic terminal, causing release of more neurotransmitter, more EPSPs, potentiation, the voltage gated channels to open, activates kinase enzymes, etc. Long-term potentiation, learning and memory. So there's a lot behind it that's been studied. That's there. Presynaptic inhibition. Release of an excitatory neurotransmitter by one nerve is inhibited by another with one of those axoaxonal synapses, those contact points down the line. So you get a smaller amount. So there's a lot that goes on. It's almost like you're going to respond to something, and in the back of your mind, that little filter goes in. Maybe I shouldn't say that. So you lose control, like some guy tackling the quarterback out of bounds instead of a field goal.
Yeah, I don't think it was his fault.
No, I don't think it would have altered the outcome of the game.
That's what I mean.
True.
Yeah.
I mean, if he was out of bounds, he would have enough time to throw another 15-yard pass.
It's Mahomes. You know what I mean?
Yeah, he's gonna make it. Yeah, I'm like, so I'm saying to myself, asshole. And they're just showing you little bits about that. Excitatory, inhibitory, blah, blah, blah. Ah! And now we're into language class. In the language of the nervous system. So there's only about a dozen that we have to be concerned with of these, and there's many of them. And they're very interesting. And you've already heard, perhaps the most interesting one to me is serotonin. With regard to addictive diseases, I think the most interesting one is dopamine. There, which has not, the fact it says dopamine doesn't even, I don't know why they named it that way historically, but interestingly it plays a pivotal role in addictive diseases that are there. As you can see, most nerves make two or more, lots of different influences. We classify them. First, we're going to classify them by their chemistry, then by what they do. Are they excitatory, are they inhibitory, or does it depend on what their content? And we get into more of that in greater detail because we build to the next chapter, which is the autonomic nervous system, which I'm sure we'll probably get started on Wednesday. Most famous, best known, unique unto itself. It's the only one in the category. Acetylcholine. We know all neuromuscular junctions. It's used by the vast majority of circuitry in the autonomic nervous system, as we will get to, and some central nervous system. Acetic acid and choline by choline acetyltransferase is the name, not that important. The one that degrades it, the acetylcholinesterase, is. Remember, acetylcholinesterase inhibitors peripherally were the foundation of nerve gases that were used originally in World War I. And really, most chemical weapons are based on that. Interestingly enough, the initial treatment, though it's not used today for Alzheimer's, was an acetylcholinesterase inhibitor that was active for whatever reason only on acetylcholine in the brain. It was called Aricept. And I'm familiar with it only because my mom took it, and actually for a year, I might have told you, helped her in the early stages when she was about 89. So, and she was definitely perceptibly better, but it had a very limited sort of shelf life in that. Yeah, it was when she was taking that, she could still beat me in Jeopardy and Scrabble. Go, Ruth. I always write those down wherever I acknowledge my mom, my late mom and dad, so I can tell my sister. Biogenic amines. Love these. What happens to amino acids metabolically? When you eat a protein, okay, it's broken down to amino acids. We absorb the amino acids, digest them. We'll go over that again. What happens to most of those amino acids? What's the first thing that they do for us to utilize? In educational psychology, this is called wait time. Wait and see if one of the students will pop up and go, I know. They deaminate. They remove the amino portion of it so they become effectively organic acids. And then we can reanimate them if we're going to assemble more specific proteins metabolically. What happens if we remove the acid part? We are left with biogenic amines. So certain amines by themselves are like that. The most common parent, tyrosine. Tyrosine is a really important one because when we get to thyroid hormone, it's tyrosine. Okay? Dopamine, epinephrine, and norepinephrine, which are pretty consistently in most circuits excitatory, not entirely, there's exceptions, are made from the amino acid tyrosine. So one of the things we do see is foods that are rich in tyrosine or become tyrosine sort of donors systemically tend to create certain kinds of reactions. People get flushed, they might get a headache, it might raise their blood pressure, might cause some digestive irregularities. So there's so there's a lot of basis for that. So those we will get to. They are known as the catecholamines. Originally, we thought that they played the major role in depression. And what we did, they're called monoamines. And so what they had, the initial antidepressants were called MAO inhibitors, monoamine oxidase inhibitors. What they did is it prolonged their effect. And when I started in pharmacology, these nearly 50 years ago, that was one of the first things you worried about. Was there were certain medications you were prescribed, if they were on MAO inhibitors, they could accelerate their heart rate, cause cardiac arrhythmias and things like that. So you had to be so that was the original theory. A lot of the original antidepressants, the tricyclic antidepressants particularly, which are still used limitedly, what they do is they effectively make more of these abundant. The way that amphetamines work is they cause the release of these, particularly the epinephrine and norepinephrine. It's almost like they're forcing them out. And again, most of those effects are excitatory. So so that's a very interesting subcategory. So catecholamines it's an important term, I think. Indole means indoles are a particular category that's derivative of. It's a chemical. Maybe you did it in microlab. Do you remember doing the indole test in microlab? Okay. Use a particular reagent and the tube turned kind of black. Okay. So indoles are something we're familiar with biological organisms. It can come from two. It can come from serotonin, comes from tryptophan, histamine comes from histidine. They're in that same category. Their effects are different. Serotonin can be excitatory or inhibitory. Like I said, there's a lot of subreceptors. The interesting thing of the most famous food that's abundant, there are certain foods that are abundant in tryptophan. And what they do is they effectively kind of create a greater degree of drowsiness because they seem to accentuate that. Most notably, hey guys, nice seeing you again. Have fun storming the castle. They acknowledge. Turkey. You ever wonder why you're so tired after Thanksgiving dinner? Well, in your case, it's probably the red wine. From the turkey. There was a great Seinfeld episode about that. That was a TV show some years ago.
Mm-hmm.
I give up. We'll come back to this. You're not responsive today. I hope you're better in lab. I need volunteers. Remember, we want volunteers, not hostages. The words of Mike Tomlin.